The night was thick with tension, the kind that clung to the air like a brewing storm. The flashing red and blue lights painted the quiet street in waves of color, reflecting off the sleek black car parked just outside a small diner. Officer Jake Carter tightened his grip on his gun, his heartbeat loud in his ears. This wasn't an ordinary traffic stop. Something about the man in the driver's seat sent a chill down his spine. The driver, a calm and composed older man, raised his hand slowly. His piercing blue eyes locked onto Jake's, holding a silent authority that made the young officer hesitate. He wasn't just some late-night wanderer or reckless driver. There was something about him, something powerful, something dangerous. "Step out of the car," Jake commanded, his voice firm but careful. The man didn't move right away. Instead, he studied Jake with an unreadable expression, as if deciding whether to comply or challenge him. After a long pause, he finally pushed open the door and stood up, revealing a tall, broad-shouldered frame. He was dressed in casual clothes, but the way he carried himself screamed discipline. A man used to being in control. Jake's fingers twitched around the trigger. "Hands where I can see them. I suggest you lower your weapon, officer." The man's voice was smooth but filled with an unmistakable warning. Jake's grip tightened. "Don't tell me what to do." The street was eerily silent, except for the distant hum of passing cars. A few onlookers inside the diner pressed against the windows, their eyes wide with curiosity. The man let out a slow breath before reaching into his back pocket. Jake reacted instantly. "Don't move." The man froze. "I'm just getting my ID." Slowly, the man obeyed, pulling out a leather wallet and flipping it open. Jake's eyes flicked to it, and his stomach dropped. Admiral Richard Hale, United States Navy. A lump formed in Jake's throat. His training screamed at him to follow protocol, but his gut twisted with uncertainty. What was a high-ranking military official doing here in the middle of the night? And why did he look completely unfazed, as if he knew exactly how this would play out? Before Jake could process it, the sound of screeching tires shattered the silence. A black SUV roared onto the scene, and within seconds, men in tactical gear swarmed the area. Jake barely had time to react before a pair of strong hands grabbed him from behind. In an instant, the gun was wrenched from his grip. His arms twisted behind his back. "Hey!" His words were cut off as cold metal clamped around his wrists. The click of handcuffs echoed in his ears. Jake struggled, his pulse racing. "What the hell is going on?" Admiral Hale stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "You should have listened, Officer Carter." Jake's mind spun, searching for answers. He had been the one in control just moments ago. But now he was the one being thrown to the ground. Something was very, very wrong. And he was about to find out just how deep this went. Jake's face pressed against the cold pavement, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The weight of the officer pinning him down made it hard to move, but that wasn't what had him frozen with fear. It was the unanswered questions swirling in his mind. Why was he the one in cuffs? Why had these men come out of nowhere like they had been waiting for this moment? And most importantly, who exactly was Admiral Richard Hale? "Get him up," one of the men ordered, his voice crisp and authoritative. Rough hands yanked Jake to his feet, and he winced as the metal cuffs dug into his wrists. He turned his head, trying to get a better look at the men surrounding him. They weren't regular cops. Their gear was different, clean, tactical, and professional. Government issue, maybe. FBI. Military police. One of them, a tall man with sharp features, patted him down quickly, checking for weapons. He found Jake's badge and yanked it from his belt, flipping it open with a glance before tossing it to Admiral Hale. "Officer Jake Carter," the Admiral read out loud, his voice calm, almost amused. He turned the badge over in his fingers, as if considering something. Jake swallowed hard. "I don't know what's going on, but you're making a mistake." The Admiral met his eyes, and for the first time, Jake noticed something unsettling. This wasn't a man surprised by the situation. He wasn't confused or angry. No, he looked like someone who had expected this to happen. Someone who had planned for it. "Am I?" the Admiral asked, tilting his head slightly. Jake's jaw clenched. "I was just doing my job. You were acting suspicious. I had reason to stop you." A small smirk flickered across the Admiral's face. "Is that so?" Jake felt his pulse quicken. There was something unnerving about the way he said it, like he knew something Jake didn't. Before he could press for answers, the man who had taken his badge stepped forward. "Sir, we need to move," he said to the Admiral. His voice low but urgent. The Admiral nodded. "Put him in the SUV." "Wait," Jake started, but he didn't get to finish. The men moved fast, dragging him toward the vehicle like he was some dangerous criminal. The back door swung open, and before he could resist, he was shoved inside. The door slammed shut behind him, sealing him in. The inside of the SUV was dark and silent. The only sound was Jake's own breathing, slightly ragged from the rush of adrenaline. He tested the cuffs, but they were tight. No chance of slipping out. A few seconds later, the door on the other side opened, and Admiral Hale slid into the seat beside him. The Admiral didn't say anything at first. He simply adjusted his jacket, looking almost relaxed. The vehicle started moving, rolling smoothly onto the road as if this was all just another routine operation. Jake exhaled sharply. "Are you going to tell me what the hell is going on?" The Admiral glanced at him. "You ask a lot of questions." "Yeah, well, getting arrested for no reason tends to do that." The Admiral let out a small chuckle. "No reason. Officer Carter, you pointed a gun at a high-ranking naval official without knowing who he was. That alone could get you in trouble." Jake narrowed his eyes. "That doesn't explain this. If I was wrong, you could have just corrected me. You didn't have to throw me in cuffs and drag me off like this." The Admiral's expression shifted slightly, a hint of something more serious beneath the surface. "This isn't about a simple misunderstanding. You got in the way of something much bigger than you realize." Jake felt a chill creep down his spine. "Bigger how?" The Admiral didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back in his seat, looking out the window as the city lights blurred past. Then, after a long pause, he spoke. "Tell me something, Officer Carter. How much do you really know about the people you work for?" Jake frowned. "What kind of question is that?" "A necessary one," the Admiral said, his voice calm but firm. "Because right now you think you're the good guy. You think you were just doing your job, keeping the streets safe. But what if I told you that the people who trained you, who gave you that badge, who told you how to do your job, what if they weren't who you thought they were?" Jake's stomach twisted. "That's ridiculous." "Is it?" The Admiral's tone was eerily steady. "Or is it just easier to believe that than to accept the truth?" Jake shook his head. "What truth?" The Admiral sighed, rubbing his temples like he was debating how much to say. Finally, he leaned in slightly. "There are things happening in this city, in this country, that don't make the news. People in power pulling strings, making decisions that affect millions. Decisions that have nothing to do with justice and everything to do with control." Jake scoffed. "And you expect me to believe you?" The Admiral's gaze was sharp. "I expect you to listen. Because whether you believe it or not, you're involved now." Jake tensed. "Involved in what?" The SUV slowed down, taking a sharp turn onto a quieter road. The streetlights grew fewer, the buildings more spaced out. They were leaving the city. Jake's unease deepened. "Where are you taking me?" The Admiral didn't answer. Jake tried to steady his breathing. He had walked into dangerous situations before, but this was different. He wasn't in control. He didn't even know the rules of the game he had been pulled into. He turned back to the Admiral. "If you're trying to scare me, it's not working." The Admiral's lips twitched in something that wasn't quite a smile. "But fear makes people reckless. And you're going to need a clear head for what comes next." Jake swallowed hard. Every instinct in his body screamed that this was only the beginning. And whatever was coming next, it wasn't going to be good. The SUV rolled to a stop in front of an old, abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The area was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt unnatural, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Jake's pulse pounded as one of the men outside opened his door, grabbing his arm to pull him out. He didn't resist, there was no point. Not yet. He needed answers first. Admiral Hale stepped out beside him, his expression unreadable. He gestured toward the building. Inside. Jake hesitated, scanning the area. No backup. No cameras. No witnesses. Whatever was about to happen, it would happen here, in the dark, far from the eyes of the world. He had to stay sharp. They led him through a rusted metal door and into a dimly lit room with a long table in the center. Stacks of documents were spread across its surface, alongside a few outdated computers humming softly. The air smelled of dust and old paper. This wasn't some random hideout. It was a place of planning. Hale walked to the table and picked up a file, flipping it open. "You should have gone home, Officer Carter," he said, his tone almost regretful. "You should have let that traffic stop go." Jake clenched his jaw. "Why don't you tell me why? What's so important that you had to drag me out here instead of explaining it back there?" Hale glanced at one of his men, who nodded and stepped forward, placing a familiar badge on the table. Jake's badge. But there was something off about it. The man flipped it over, revealing a small microchip embedded in the back, something Jake had never seen before. "What is that?" Jake asked, his stomach tightening. Hale studied him carefully. "Tracker. A recorder. Something your department installed without telling you." Jake's blood ran cold. "That's a lie. Is it?" Hale pushed the badge toward him. "You ever wonder why certain cases never get solved? Why certain criminals walk free while others disappear without a trace? Your department isn't just enforcing the law, Officer Carter. They're selecting who the law applies to." Jake shook his head. "Oh, I don't believe that." Hale sighed. "You don't have to. The proof is right there." One of the men reached for a remote and clicked a button. A monitor on the far side of the room flickered to life, showing a grainy black and white feed. At first, Jake didn't understand what he was looking at. But then his stomach dropped. It was him. Footage of him in his patrol car at the station, walking through the streets. Every move he had made in the past few weeks, recorded. Logged. He swallowed hard. Why would they do this? "Because they needed to know if you'd follow orders," Hale said simply. "And tonight you proved that you don't." Jake felt his breath hitch. "I was just doing my job." Hale nodded. "Exactly. And that's the problem." Before Jake could respond, the warehouse door burst open, and a rush of footsteps echoed through the space. Armed men poured in. His department's special response unit. His people. For a brief second, relief washed over him. They had found him. They'd put an end to this. But then the officer in charge stepped forward, his gun drawn, not at Hale but at Jake. "Officer Carter," the man said, his voice cold. "You're under arrest." Jake's mind spun. For what? Unauthorized interference in a classified operation. Treason. Jake's mouth went dry. This wasn't just some misunderstanding. They had set him up. From the moment he pulled over that car, from the second he pointed his gun at Hale, they had been waiting for him to make a mistake. He turned to Hale, searching for some kind of explanation. But the Admiral simply watched, his expression calm. Jake's voice was hoarse. "You knew this would happen." Hale nodded. "I warned you." Jake's fists clenched. "Then why bring me here? Why show me this?" Hale stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Because now you have a choice." Jake's pulse pounded in his ears. "What choice?" Hale glanced at the officers closing in. "Come with me and I can show you the truth. Stay, and you'll take the fall for things you didn't even know you were a part of." Jake's breath came fast and shallow. His entire world had flipped in a matter of hours. Everything he thought he knew, his job, his loyalty, the system he believed in, was unraveling in front of him. The lead officer took another step forward. Last chance, Carter. Surrender now. Jake looked between them. His colleagues, his department, the people he had trusted. Then at Hale, the man who had exposed the cracks in everything he believed. For the first time in his life, he didn't know which side was right. And then, before he could decide, the lights cut out. A single gunshot rang through the air. And the warehouse erupted into chaos. The warehouse plunged into darkness, and for a split second, everything was still. Then chaos erupted. Shouts filled the air, boots pounded against the concrete floor, and another gunshot echoed through the vast space. Jake dropped instinctively, hitting the ground hard as he tried to get his bearings. His heart slammed against his ribs, his breath coming fast. He couldn't see, but he could hear the sound of bodies moving, weapons clicking, orders being shouted. A strong grip yanked him up. He tensed, expecting one of his own officers, but a voice whispered harshly in his ear. "Move." It was Hale. Jake didn't have time to argue. He felt himself being pulled forward, guided through the confusion. The air was thick with tension, but before the emergency lights flickered back on, they had already slipped through a back exit into the cold night. The sound of fighting still raged behind them, but out here in the open there was only silence. Jake stumbled forward, his wrists still cuffed. What the hell was that? Hale didn't stop moving. That was them tying up loose ends. Jake shook his head. "You knew this was coming. That's why you brought me here." Hale finally slowed, turning to face him. Even in the dim glow of the streetlights, his expression was unreadable. "I needed you to see it for yourself." Jake clenched his jaw. "And now what? You expect me to run? Become a fugitive?" Hale exhaled, glancing down the empty road. A black car idled in the distance, its engine barely making a sound. He nodded toward it. "I expect you to make a choice." Jake's hands curled into fists. His whole life he had followed the rules. He had believed in the badge, in the system, in the idea that justice always found its way. But tonight had shattered that belief. His department, the very people he had trusted, had turned against him without hesitation. "Why me?" he asked finally. "Out of all the cops in this city, why go through all this for me?" Hale studied him for a long moment before answering. "Because you hesitated." Jake frowned. "What?" "In that moment when you pointed your gun at me, you hesitated," Hale said. "Most officers in your position would have pulled the trigger without question. But you stopped. You thought. You listened." Jake let the words sink in. It was such a small thing, barely a second of doubt, but it had changed everything. Hale took a step back, giving him space. "You can still walk away. Go back to your life, pretend none of this happened. But if you do, they'll own you. They'll watch every move you make, waiting for the day you slip again. And when you do, there won't be a second chance." Jake swallowed hard. The choice in front of him wasn't just about survival. It was about truth. About what kind of man he wanted to be. He glanced at the road behind him, toward the warehouse still shrouded in shadows. He could hear faint sirens in the distance. Backup maybe. Or cleanup. Either way, it wasn't his concern anymore. He looked back at Hale, then at the car waiting in the darkness. His entire life had been about following orders. Tonight he would finally decide for himself. Taking a deep breath, Jake stepped forward. And didn't look back.